People say all the time, trust your gut. But if you're anything like me, my gut has led me astray more times than I can count. So, how do you learn to trust yourself? How do you learn to know if that voice in your head is holding you back or if it's the thing that's going to guide you to where you really need to go? Welcome to Change Made Easy. Changing your habits, behaviors, and routines is hard. We make it easy. I'm Paul Levitin, a board-certified behavior change coach who's been helping people just like you create better habits in their health, wealth, and relationships for over 12 years. My goal with this podcast is to help you to understand the science and master the art of change. Because when change is easy, leading a happy, fulfilling life becomes automatic. Today, I'm speaking with Victor Pierantoni about how you can better understand yourself and how you can break out of self-imposed delusion that's holding you back from creating the change that you're seeking. Victor is a podcaster, a coach, a teacher, a mentor, and a modern-day philosopher. Victor's the real deal. I was introduced to Victor through a mutual friend, and I checked out his podcast called the Zen Stoic Path, and as soon as I heard it, I knew we'd get along. Zen Buddhism and Stoic philosophy have been two of the most impactful schools of thought on my own personal journey of growth. It's where I learn a lot of what I teach and talk about on this very show. Victor was actually the youngest ever Tony Robbins certified life coach before actually rising to be the #1 coach in that entire organization. And that alone speaks volumes. But Victor realized that his philosophy of Zen Stoicism needed to be shared more widely, so he left the Robbins organization to go out on his own and change the world with his teaching. So if you've ever felt yourself striving towards something, but doing it from a place of negativity, maybe like losing weight because you hate your body, or you've wanted to be successful just because you hate being broke, then this episode could be a game changer for you. If you think it's enough to have good intentions, make sure to listen for what Victor has to say about fragmented intentions and why philosophy, for the sake of philosophy, is utterly meaningless. And with that, please enjoy this conversation with Victor Pierantoni. What is Zen Stoicism?
So Zen Stoicism is a hybrid philosophy between the two inspiring philosophies there, which would be Zen Buddhism as well as Stoic philosophy. Now, when it first began, and I did it in podcast form, it was here's a little bit of Zen, here's a little bit of Stoicism, and just kind of talked about how from each of those schools of thought, how they've influenced my life, how they've helped me with clients. And then over time, Zen Stoic philosophy became its own thing. In other words, it became its own unique philosophy that is inspired from the two, but different from the originating philosophies. And essentially what it is very aligned with a lot of the ways that you think, actually. Like in listening to your podcast prior to coming on here, I know that you're all about focusing on human nature, focusing on the humanness of our experience, which I really love, because Zen Stoic philosophy ultimately helps the practitioner to create unshakable inner peace by becoming present to the direct experience of their own humanity. And it's based on a framework of what are called intentions and delusions, where the whole core of the philosophy exists.
Well, who wouldn't want an unshakable framework to live their life off of? So I can see that would be extremely helpful. And the intentions and delusions are something I actually did want to speak with you about. I was just listening to your podcast, shameless plug, where you spoke about those. So, and I don't know if that's the same, something I heard on your podcast with the intentions and delusions, and also what you called the 4 paradoxes. Are those the same thing, or could you go into a little bit what those intentions are and what the paradoxes are?
Yeah. So the intentions and delusions is a framework that it operates on a meta principle with the axiomatic presupposition that the purpose of life is to live it from a meta purpose, as in like everybody's purpose on that level is just to live our lives. And this is something that I was inspired through Bruce Lee's writings, where he wrote, "Life is better lived than conceptualized." And that quote has always stuck with me, and it helped to actually flush out this framework of intentions and delusions. The idea is that over the years of working with people, I've realized that we have 5 fundamental experiences of how we engage with life. The first one being feeling, then we have thinking, and we have doing, expressing, and being. So what I've noticed is that anything that we experience in our lives will fall into one of those 5 categories. And the intentions are ways of engaging with life that bring you into the direct experience, the direct present experience of life itself. The delusions are a way of disengaging with life. So ultimately, you can think of an intention as a way of being that brings you into the present, whereas delusion brings you into abstraction in life. And so if we think about it from those 5, the first set, they're all different pair bonds. And the first set has to do with feeling. So it's essentially embrace versus resistance. Now, ultimately what this means is embrace is a way of feeling. It's a way that we actually feel our emotions, that we actually feel our sensations, that we are associated in our experience. Whereas resistance is a way of not feeling. Now, the way that the intentions and delusions work is these are not just thoughts that you have, or they're not just feelings. They go deeper than that to the unconscious level in terms of how we actually operate in the world. So if a person is being intentional, it brings them into the present moment. If they're being delusional, it pulls them out into some abstraction of reality where they're typically living in their thoughts or conceptualizations about reality. So, for example, the content of what a person does in their life does not actually have any bearing on whether they're in an intention and delusion. It has everything to do with the context of why they're doing what they're doing. So, for instance, if I always like to use this example, I love David Goggins. I think he's got some great stuff. And at the same time, a lot of what he does, while it looks like discipline from a content perspective, he's like working hard, he's, hardening his mind, all these things. If you listen to why he's doing it, he talks about how he's getting away from his feelings or numbing the pain. So in that case, the workout is actually a way of not feeling emotions, just as an example. So when we disengage, typically what we're doing is we're trying to borrow from one of the other 5 of the fundamental experiences of life. So oftentimes, instead of feeling, a person will ruminate and try to problem solve and think about things ad nauseum. Sometimes instead of feeling, they'll go and do something. Or sometimes instead of actually feeling their feelings, they'll kind of word vomit all over somebody and use expression. And anytime we try to borrow from a different area of that life, we start to create what is called emotional debt, where we're kind of like using credit to not experience that thing in place of something else that we think is more appropriate for that situation.
Hey, real quick, we'll be back to the show in just a few seconds, but right now I have to ask you for a huge favor. If you're getting value out of this episode so far, take 2 seconds and share it with a friend. I mean, right now, literally, hit the little share button and send it in a text to your roommate or your cousin or your mom or your brother or your sister. Seriously, spread the love. If you like what you're hearing, then that's the best way that you can show support for this show. Because maybe you're like Eliza Kay, who said, "This podcast is both warm and inviting, but real enough to push and motivate me." Or you're like Dalton, who said, "Paul is an amazing host, and his podcast is a must listen." Don't you want to share this awesomeness with your friends and family? Don't be a gatekeeper. It only takes a second. It helps me grow and reach a new audience, and you seem like a genius friend who recommends new, awesome podcasts. We all win. All right, go send that text, and now let's get back to the show. I appreciate that example a lot. David Goggins is a funny one, and I agree. Again, we spoke about this a little bit before we were recording, where I come to a lot of the similar conclusions, but my route to get there is a little bit different, because I look at someone like a David Goggins and that whole like rah motivational, like that world of just like 75 hard and just man up and just discipline. And it's just for me, it's just, if it were that easy, it would already be done. And if that were the secret, the one little secret, oh gosh, why didn't I just be more disciplined? Like if that were an actual answer, then the world wouldn't be in such disrepair. And
yes,
And then I also see that, as you said, like he's like working out so hard, running ultra marathons and stuff, but running away from this pain, or to silence the inner demon, or to whatever it is that whatever verbiage they use. But it's like, I've never seen someone still to this day who's gotten somewhere positive coming from a place of negativity. Like, I've never seen someone being like, I hate my life and I hate this and I'm running away from it. It's, I use the analogy of like, are you running away from, or are you running towards?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because something that I've taught and believed is that it's never either or. It's
Mm-hmm.
always both and. It's the gray
Mm-hmm.
area. I've said that when I first started this podcast, I almost named it the gray area, because to me, that's where everything is, right? It's always like,
Yes.
we want these extreme answers, except that now, as you're talking, these do seem like very binary choices. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you can't, there is no gray area there. Am I getting that wrong? Is there an in between, or is it I'm either in one or I'm in the other?
So with that framework specifically, I mean, we can have certainly a harmony between them. There are going to be times where we engage in delusion. And the reason why they're even called delusions is because short term, a lot of the time, they are rewarding. Like, you can have a quick win, you can make some quick cash, you can get somebody to have a certain impression of you and like you and give you an opportunity or start a relationship. So short term, they can work. But if we're consistently disengaging with life in these ways, then over time, they start to create gaps in our perception. So for instance, one of the pair bonds is sincerity versus performance. And sincerity is a way of expressing, performance is a way of not expressing. In other words, because when we are performing, we're essentially putting on a mask. And rather than expressing what is alive within us, we are impressing some kind of an image or some kind of a perception on the person that we're speaking to. We can even attempt to impress upon ourselves. Like, if we don't have an actual physical audience of people to impress to, we can actually create audiences in our own minds, but that's a whole rabbit hole. But essentially the point of what that is that short term, you can perform and pretend to be somebody that you may not be. And that might get you a foot in the door with a job, or a foot in the door with a certain social circle or friend group. However, every time that we perform, we're not expressing what is alive within us. We're technically engaging in some dishonesty, if you will. And when we're engaging in that, we're putting our faith in what isn't versus what is. And so we're putting our faith outside of reality. And the more, if we keep doing that, then eventually we lose ourselves. And if we do get rewarded for that, oftentimes we're climbing the wrong mountain and we get to the top of it. And that's where you have people who, like, you've coached these types of people where they're extremely financially successful, and yet they're at the top of the mountain going, shit, I climbed the wrong mountain. And oftentimes that can be a result of performance. It could be a result of, some of the other ones. But the interesting thing about the intentions and delusions is that when a person's being fully intentional, fully present, they're doing all five at the same time, all five of the intentions. And sometimes one thing that I like to say is that the road to hell is not paved with good intentions. The road to hell is paved with fragmented intentions, because sometimes I might be sincere. I might be saying what's real to me, but maybe I'm resisting the feelings. Or maybe I am engaging in the delusion of control, which is essentially, so I'll just talk about the second pair bind. It's understanding versus control. Understanding is a way of thinking. Control is a way of not thinking. So understanding is ultimately leading with a question, leading with a desire or a curiosity of sorts to learn, to expand one's perception. Whereas control is coming in with an already preconceived conclusion or script that they're just regurgitating, or it might not even be their own beliefs, but this person might be, instead of thinking and asking a question or questioning their assumptions, they might just engage in talking and giving a conclusive statement to what they think. So we can be in one of the intentions and then the other four be in delusion at the same time. So this is where the idea of self-trust and intuition comes into play, and actually being able to know your system and know how your body, how your mind signals to you when you're being intentional versus when you're being delusional. And that's something that I work with my clients all the time, is actually helping them understand, how does their system, and when I say system, I'm referring to mind, body, spirit, how does their system in its entirety signal to them when something is a yes, when something is a no, when they're being intentional versus being delusional. And what's interesting is I'll take my clients through all 5 of those pair bonds to ask them what each of them feel like. And there's these very distinct physiological responses that they have to being in each one, to being cued where they're at. So essentially, what I would say is that when it comes to the intentions and delusions, the reason why we want to check with ourselves is because we can do all the right content in our lives. In other words, we can say and do the right things, but that doesn't necessarily equate inner peace. The prerequisite to inner peace is having a sense of self-acceptance. In order to have a sense of self-acceptance, you need to be at peace with why you're doing everything that you're doing, or why you're engaging or saying or doing life in the way that you're doing it.
So one of the things as you're talking that's coming up to me is you mentioned knowledge of self. And that to me, you mentioned meta skills. Like that to me is a meta skill, that it's peeling the onion back, right? We have all heard that analogy. Eventually you keep peeling the onion, you get to the center. And like knowledge of self is one of those center things that it's like, this makes everything else easier and everything else kind of fall into place. And it seems almost so obvious that's why we don't pay attention to it, because it's like, what even is knowledge of self? What do you mean I'm disconnected from my body? It's my body. How can I be disconnected from it? How can I not know myself? It's the only thing that I do know. But when we start to dig into this stuff, we see that that's actually the farthest from the case. And it's very hard to answer these external questions, or these questions about how do I go through life, if I can't even understand what's happening within me, or understand why I'm doing the things that I do, which is why, as you said, I like to talk about human nature, because I think that's where a lot of this stuff stems from. But I'm curious if you could give us 1 or 2 of the more tactical side of things that you get to give people to start making these connections and start to come back to that knowledge of self and meeting themselves where they are.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love that you bring it into the practicality, because I've always said this, and I think we talked about this the first time that we connected. It's this idea that if your philosophy is about philosophy, it's meaningless. It becomes a hollow shell. So we want to direct it towards our human experience. So the practical way to start to get into this is by building a relationship with our unconscious mind. Now, most of the world has no idea about their unconscious mind. They are just completely in the conscious mind, and the conscious mind doesn't have the same processing power as the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind runs the body, so anything that we feel, we're accessing that through our unconscious mind. Our unconscious mind also records everything that we've ever experienced with remarkable accuracy, and it is this storehouse of memory and wisdom and knowledge for every one individual for whatever they need in life. And so when I work with clients, the first thing that we do is we start building a relationship with the unconscious. Now, in order to build a relationship with the unconscious, there's a technique that I've created, which is a combination of 3 previous techniques, which is called sovereign awareness. And this is the very first step, that if I'm working with a client, we need to get this step down, because this is what actually creates the self-trust and intuition. So basically the way that it works in a practical sense is we combine 3 techniques. The first one is what is called the hakalau, which is from Hawaiian shamanism called huna. And the hakalau is basically just a state of being a person can go into where you relax the muscles in your eyes and you go into peripheral vision. So you essentially, the way that you begin, and I have a whole like free course on this, or free product, if you will, that people can go and learn how to do this. That if anybody listening to the show wants it, they can always DM me at victor.zenstoic, and I'll feel happy to send it over to them. But basically, when you go into the hakalau, you're focusing in on a spot in the room or the environment. And as you look in the direction of that spot, you just allow your peripheral vision to start to open up. So you allow the muscles in your eyes and your face to relax. And as you maintain focus in one single direction, you essentially just open up your peripherals. Now, when this happens, like when we actually go into peripheral vision, what what ends up happening is we come out of tunnel vision or foveal vision. And anytime that we have problems, anytime that we think that we have problems, rather, it is because we are in tunnel vision, either on something in the environment or even on a thought in our own mind. So by going into peripheral vision, we actually start to get into the perspective of the unconscious mind, where suddenly everything that you're observing, even though there are different objects and all that in the room, everything kind of melts into like one thing that you're looking at. There's no things because you're not cutting them apart or separating them with your conscious mind. So once that happens, I then have them do something called anchored breathing, which is breathing down into all the way down into the belly. And when you breathe down into the belly, basically it's taking all the air in as much as you possibly can into your belly until you can't take it anymore. And then instead of exhaling like blowing out, like, or sighing out, like instead of doing that, it's just letting the air fall. So basically the way that we let the air fall is we just collapse the diaphragm. And upon collapsing the diaphragm, there's like this weightless feeling. So when you're doing the hakalau, plus you're doing that simultaneously, it is virtually impossible to be in any kind of negative state while you're doing that. Mainly because you have actually let go of everything that you might be thinking about or focusing on. So you're just present. And upon coming into that presence, I usually have a client, or even with myself when I do that for 2 to 5 minutes. And once we're there, then we have like a clear slate where the unconscious mind is on and the conscious mind is not essentially like coming in and throwing random intrusive thoughts. And then from that point, we do something. The third technique is called unconscious signaling, where I basically ask a person, have your unconscious mind show you, what does a yes feel like in your system? What does a no feel like in your system? And then just noticing the contrast between the two. And people from all different walks of life have various different experiences. Like I've heard all kinds of things where like somebody will feel it in their hands and somebody will feel it in their forehead and somebody will feel it in their stomach. And there's all these different feelings that come up. But the key to that is that we want to find our own unique way that our unconscious signals us. So upon doing this, you can also do the same exercise for the intentions and delusions. You can say, unconscious mind, what does it feel like when I'm in the intention of embrace? What does it feel like when I'm resisting? And people have various physiological reactions, and we can actually map to those as a form of guidance.
It's extremely powerful tools, and I appreciate you sharing that and breaking it down in such depth. It's interesting, as you were breaking that down piece by piece, as you were talking about the first piece, the vision part, and kind of the release of focus and use of the peripherals, I started thinking about breathing exercises, because the way I've taught breathing in the past is that it's making something that is usually unconscious conscious. Breathing,
Mm-hmm.
one of the few bodily functions that happens autonomically, which means automatic. It gets controlled by the subconscious part of your nervous system, but that we can also control consciously. Like I can't, or most people can't, I don't think you can probably speed up your heart rate just by thinking about it, or speed up how fast your blood is pumping, or make your fingers tingle or something like that. But you can
Mm-hmm.
change your breathing. And as you're talking about that vision, normally we control a certain aspect of it, like what are we staring at, but not the peripherals, not the focused aspect of it, except in certain moments. And then your very next piece was to go into the breathing, and it's the same thing. It's taking that, what is normally unconscious, and making it conscious. And the
Mm-hmm.
dual benefit there is, one, as you said, it's very hard to focus on other things. The reason our brain makes those things unconscious is because it needs the conscious awareness to pay attention to what it thinks is more important. And that's
Mm-hmm.
your phone and traffic and the person who answered an email weird to you or something like that. You can only focus on so many things at once. Realize, right, sitting here, anyone listening, your shirt is on your body, your pants are on your body, but you don't feel it consciously sitting there until maybe now that I pointed it out, you might feel it because now your brain is more aware of it. Your feet are on the floor, but you don't feel that. Your tongue is on the roof of your mouth, but you don't feel that. All of these things are happening, but you can only pay attention to so many things at any given moment. So training your brain to shift that focus at the right time or under your own control is a big part of what I'm so passionate about, which is just taking back control. As you mentioned, so many people don't even understand what the subconscious mind is, or that this is controlling us at any given time. And my whole point with this podcast and with everything that I teach is just like, you can't change what you don't know. The first step of change, I teach what I call the change loop. The first step is awareness, because you don't know what you don't know, and you definitely can't change what you don't know. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, that I've heard you speak about, is the backwards law. So I was wondering if you could go into that and explain that to the listeners.
Yeah, for sure. So the backwards law is something that was talked about by Alan Watts and then brought up again by Mark Manson, the guy that wrote The Subtle Art. And I'll paraphrase what it is. The backwards law is essentially that the more rich and powerful you want to be, the more insignificant and poor you end up feeling. That the more you pursue a positive experience, the more you actually experience negative feelings. Whereas the reverse is also true. Is like the acceptance or the embrace of a negative feeling is actually in and of itself a positive experience. So the idea is that you cannot have light without dark, up without down. So when we are deciding that things are important in our lives, basically we are asking for one thing consciously, but unconsciously there's the other side of it that we may not be aware of, or that we may not be choosing to be aware of, right? We may be choosing to dissociate and disengage from that. And the model that helps me understand the backwards law, it's this idea of the principle of perception. And the principle of perception is ultimately talking about how we actually receive communication and how the backwards law actually functions. So we've been talking a lot about the unconscious mind, and one of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung is that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you'll call it fate. Mainly because the conscious mind is only designed to focus on one thing at a time and can manage about 7 ± 2 pieces of information. Anytime we go over that, that's when we go into overwhelm. Overwhelm is ultimately us trying to process too much consciously. And as a result, we have the feelings of angst and stress and whatever else comes up. But the communication model, the way that we can look at it is, the human brain is designed to take in 126 bits of information per second and can consciously focus on 7 ± 2, which is why we're able to remember phone numbers, especially before area codes became a thing. And even though we're only able to take in 126 bits, according to the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, we are being hit with about 11 million bits of information per second. Right? Whether that's radio waves, Wi-Fi, other people's emotions, advertising, all kinds of stimulus in the environment. So it's imagine as though I'm handing you 126 toothpicks. It's like, that's very manageable. But if I handed you 11 million toothpicks, it's not like, it's unfathomable for us to think of that. So our mind, what it does is it deletes, distorts, and generalizes information. And it does so. It filters all that information that's coming in, all that stimulus based on our beliefs, values, and attitudes. In other words, what's important to us. So as a result of it filtering based on what's important to us, the result is that we see ourselves in everything and everyone. In other words, if we're seeing something outside and it's grabbing our attention, we're ultimately being called to that thing or that's coming to our attention because it exists somewhere within us. That's why there's resonance. That's why there's even any kind of compelling reason to look at something or to focus on something. So the idea of this is that when you set a new goal or an intention with anything, right, you're deciding on what's important to you in that moment. And by deciding what's important to you, you are altering your entire reality and how you experience it. So there are going to be 3 things ultimately that we end up noticing anytime we set a new goal or intention. For the most part, we have neutral stimuli, which like stuff that doesn't mean anything, stuff that's going to fill most of our environment. Then we have what I like to call guiding omens. These can also be talked about as coincidences, synchronicities, serendipity. These are essentially almost like positive signs that move you towards what you've decided is important to you. Then the third thing is we have obstacles that come up. And the obstacles are the thing that most of the time people will allow to deter them from actually pursuing whatever that goal or intention is. The obstacles come up in the form of circumstances, people, and even what seem like our own thoughts. as a way of showing us where we're not yet free within ourselves. And so when the obstacle comes up, we have the choice. It's, do we allow the obstacle to overcome us and tell us who we are? Or do we overcome the obstacle and use it as an opportunity to set ourselves free just another iteration more, which is why Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way, is so powerful, is because unconsciously, when we set goals, we not only project out what is important and like what's going to move us there, but we also project out the obstacles themselves. We start to see things that would get in our way, and it's our unconscious's way of giving us an opportunity to set ourselves free from those things. And when you think about it like that, then the backwards law starts to make a lot more sense. It's like, oh, this stuff is coming up because I haven't taken the time to face this or acknowledge this within myself. And now that I have this opportunity, I have a choice. Do I let it tell me who I am, or do I tell the world who I am by overcoming this thing?
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrestle with. The way I phrase this is, wanting is evidence of lack. So the very essence of wanting a thing, of having a goal, sets us up for a disconnect, because I only want that which I do not have. And in there lies discomfort. So the Buddhist teachings would say that that is where all discomfort stems from, that wanting that which what we do not have is where all discomfort comes from and all suffering, and that the answer to that is acceptance of having nothing. And when you can accept that, all of a sudden you no longer want, and when you no longer want, you have the space to actually go out and get. So it's a paradox of like, I shouldn't want the thing, and yet I do. And that is where I find a lot of people get tripped up with this stuff. So if wanting is evidence of lack, and inherent in wanting brings up a discrepancy, and again, going to Buddhist or whatever principles, it's to want for less is the answer. But if we take that too far in one direction, then we end up just being the monk on the mountain who meditates all the time and doesn't need anything or want anything. But there are things in life that we want. We do want to be able to be successful. We do want to be able to support our family. We do want to be strong or look good or just have a nice car, whatever these things are. So how do we balance not wanting with the things that we just do want?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it is certainly paradoxical in the teachings. And somebody, even myself, like hearing that for the first time years ago was like, what? What do I do with that information? And I remember Alan Watts, he talked about this story of how a student went to his master, and he told the master how he suffers. And the master says, well, you suffer because you desire. And so the student's like, all right, cool. Then I'm not going to desire. And so he like comes back after and he's like, hey, I've let go of my desire, but I still suffer. And he goes, because you desire not to desire. And it's still another ideal that we are measuring ourselves against. And so when it comes to this idea of the craving or the wanting, I think there's a big difference in the way that we language things. So language I find to be extremely important in terms of how we're representing the world, because the way that we speak to ourselves, the way that we speak to others creates our reality. So if we say, I want, every time we use a word, words are essentially symbols for what are called internal representations. So the way that we internally represent the world, our words are meaningless until they point to a picture or a movie or a representation of life that we have in our head. So every time we use a word, it points to something. So when we use the phrase, I want, we are very likely pointing to some kind of an internal representation that is without, or that is expressing lack. So the way that we express that is going to make a big difference. The other thing too, at least in my life, where I've started to see the difference or see the changes from wanting into essentially having, like, while being, I wouldn't say completely detached emotionally, but detached mentally from the thing, and like being able to enjoy the actual experience of it, is I switched. Anytime that I would want something, I'd stop saying I want or I need, and I would start saying I choose to, or I'd start saying I will, or even beyond that. I remember saying this to myself almost 2 years ago, where I said, I am ready and I trust that I will experience this relationship, this type of relationship with somebody that I love. And this is when I was single, I was saying this. Upon, I think 2 weeks after I started saying I am ready and I trust, which is a decision, not a point to lack, I met my girlfriend 2 weeks later. And I was just saying I'm ready and I trust. So I wasn't in a state of craving. I was in a state of trusting and readiness that I chose for myself, because being ready and trusting points to a very different internal representation of life.
Yeah, I'm very keen on words as well. I think words have an immense amount of power. And it's funny, as you said, want, you threw air quotes up for people listening. And I do the same thing with should. Anytime I say should, I do air quotes because the shoulds don't exist. But as you said it like that, it kind of realized that like want doesn't exist either, because you either do or you don't. So to say, I want to do this, why wouldn't the phrasing be I will or I am? Because if you're wanting, that is bringing up a discrepancy. I want to eat better. No, I'm eating healthy or I'm not. I want to be more intentional in my relationship. Again, I'm either doing it or I'm not doing it. So want is one of those words that almost placates us, where it gives us this false sense of I'm taking a step when I actually haven't. I go from I'm not doing anything to wanting feels like a step, but it's not. You actually haven't gone anywhere. You're still not doing anything. So that just popped up for me as kind of a aha moment, where just like I catch myself in the shoulds, anytime I should something, I backtrack and I check myself and I go, no, should doesn't exist. So either I will or I won't. And I'm going to throw want into the same category, because if I want something bad enough to make it happen, then it will happen. And if I don't want something bad enough to make it happen, then I don't actually want it anyway. And I can't really say that I do. And I think that's the important thing for people to take away from this. Again, people, when I talk like this, I can think that I'm like being mean or something. It's like, well, if you wanted it, you would. But that is the truth.
It is true. Yeah.
You do what you want. Your actions reveal your true desires. So when people are saying to me, I want something, but their actions are going in a different direction, then it's like, well, one of those two wins, and your actions will always win over your words.
Mm-hmm.
But the words start to create the actions if you use different words. As you said, I will, I accept, I trust is different than I want. Want is very passive. So I'm curious if there's any other verbiage or words, as we're talking about literal words and how people can change the way they talk both to others and to themselves, that you've used either with yourself or with clients, that you've started to shift away from certain words or to other words in particular.
I mean, definitely the ones that we've mentioned so far, right? The I want to, I will, like shifting that. And I need can also be shifted to I will, or I trust, or I'm ready. The other one I really like that you brought up is the word should, because anytime somebody uses the word should, typically, depending on how they're using it, sometimes it's a social convention. It's a form of performance of like, I can acknowledge that this thing objectively would be good for me that this person's telling me to do, but I'm not actually going to do it, but I'll tell them that I should do it so that they'll accept me. So that's one way. And then there's also like, this person should be more X. And that one is like an arguing with reality kind of thing. Like basically you're saying the reality that is should be different, or like I want it to be different than it is. And anytime we argue with reality, that's when we're really essentially putting ourselves in a tough spot, because we're not going to win that argument ever. Reality is. And it's the whole thing that Marcus Aurelius talks about, to essentially be disgruntled at anything, so to speak, is basically like a secession from nature. It's like saying that I am somehow outside of nature. I'm alone, this separate ego in this bag of skin, sitting here alone and afraid, and here's this like world that I'm in. It's like, it's not quite how it works. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. It's like, we're not separate. We are part of nature. We are like one with it. We get to have an individual experience, but it doesn't mean that we're separate from it. And so when it comes to these words and all that, and especially with this whole thing of wanting or desiring or anything, What I like to also talk about is the idea of desiring from a place of having. So this is where the whole gratitude idea comes in. And what I've noticed, at least in my life, is that anytime that I would complain about anything, life would give me more to complain about. Anytime I would use my words to express gratitude, life would give me more to be grateful for. And even in moments, in the past, the way I practiced gratitude is I would practice gratitude for the things that landed in my preferences. Then I realized that was a very conditional way of practicing gratitude. I was only grateful if things went the way that my mind said they should go. Again, the word should there. But once I started practicing gratitude from a place that was more unconditional, in other words, being grateful for everything, right? The good, the bad, the things that are in my preferences as well as outside of my preferences, and using that as kind of a foundation for the way that I thought about things. It changed the way that I spoke to myself. It changed the way that I reacted to certain things. Like if I got an unexpected bill in the past, I might have been like, oh, I can't believe I have to pay $1,000 for this thing. Now, if that happens, I'm more like, I'm very grateful that I have the money to pay for this thing. It's like, yes, it was unexpected. Maybe I had purposes to put that money elsewhere. And the fact that I have it, I can be grateful for. And that desiring from a place of having has also shifted the way, not just that I speak and use words, but also the way that I look at everything.
It's interesting as you're talking about Marcus Aurelius, and we are a part of nature, not separate from it. I go back to the part you were talking about a few minutes ago about peripheral vision, and how when we're zoned into something, we see the hard edges and we see everything as separate pieces. And yet when you zoom out a bit and you relax and let yourself go into your peripherals, you see that everything kind of blends together. And it's the same thing with this. We think that we are this separate, special entity. I'm this special little snowflake and I'm different and everything else is outside of me, but it's not. We are all part of life. Earth is a living, breathing organism, which we are just a part of, and we are all in this same thing together. So it's just interesting to me. I kind of like see these like analogous pieces, and something that listeners know I say all the time is everything is the same. And that's why I like this stuff, because Marcus Aurelius was alive almost 3,000 years ago. And yet here we are today talking about the same stuff, arguing over the same principles, and the things that he was teaching are the same guiding light. And then you talk about something like gratitude. And, you said the more grateful I was, I got more things to be grateful for. And the less grateful I was, the less things that I had to be grateful for. And again, I know myself, people may be listening, but myself, a few years back would hear that and go like, that's such like woo woo nonsense, like the energy universe or whatever. It's like, one, I believe that there's something to be said for that, right? What you put out into the universe comes back. But again, just going down the more like scientific, rational route, your brain is a pattern seeking machine. That's all your brain does. That's what has allowed humans to become the top of the food chain. It is what has allowed us to live the lives that we live, is that we look for patterns so that we can see patterns, so that we can relegate those patterns to our subconscious. So the things that we do over and over again become easier. Therefore, if you train yourself to see gratitude and be grateful, that becomes the pattern that your brain seeks out. And when you are presented with an opportunity, because everything is a choice, when you're presented with an opportunity to either be grateful or disgruntled, as in getting $1,000 bill in the mail that you weren't expecting, you have a choice right there to go left or right, to go negative or positive. And the route that your brain chooses to take will be the path that it's taken the most times before. So if you've been the person who has always kicked and screamed and woe is me, that will continue to be the story that you've told. Whereas if you start to give yourself gratitude and look for gratitude and give gratitude in that split second moment, because again, this is subconscious, this is not a conscious decision, you start to become the person who sees good things and sees gratitude. And so that's one of the most powerful tools that we have in our disposal. Again, not just from a place of, oh gosh, the universe, and I need to be, thankful to energy and stuff like that. It's like, I mean, I believe that too, but I think that it's helpful to know that there's a real, literal reason for the way your brain works that we can start to do this. And, the last thing before I let you go, Victor, that I ask every guest, you've given us a lot of tools already. So you can feel free to repeat something. Gratitude is one that's brought up a lot when I ask this question, but feel free to go in any direction that you want. If you had one action step that you could leave listeners to start living a happier, healthier life right now when this episode ends, as soon as they take their headphones out, what would it be?
Giving themselves more time to just be. And that can look like meditation. That can look like walking in nature. Doesn't necessarily need to be stillness for everybody, but any type of experience that will allow you to just be in your environment. It's the simplest thing in the world to just be, and yet we always find ourselves separating from the present, separating from our environment, living in our thoughts, and giving yourself the opportunity to just be, whether, again, through meditation or being in nature, whatever that is for you, gives you the ability to clear the slate of all of the thoughts that you might have, the triggers, the unconscious habits, all of that. Just being, for example, in that technique, sovereign awareness, is a really, I would say, an amazing place to start. It's just being able to be with yourself.
Sometimes we get very tactical on this show, and sometimes we go deep into philosophical. Today we did both. I really think that if you can try to understand the concepts that Victor is talking about, it will lead to an easier life, a life in flow, rather than a life where you're fighting against the current and always feeling drained and devoid of energy. Stoicism is incredibly powerful. Zen Buddhism is incredibly impactful. When you combine those two, you get a revolutionary new philosophy, and that is change made easy. And be sure to check out Victor and all he has going at zenstoic.com and learn about his podcast, his coaching, and all the other stuff he's doing. I've included the link in the show notes. Definitely check out his podcast. Before you go, I just have to ask you for a huge favor. If you enjoyed or got value from this episode at all, then take a moment and leave a rating and review in the podcast app that you're listening or watching on. If you like the show and you want me to continue to create more episodes and be able to get awesome guests that will help make changing your life easier, then this is the best way you can show support. You can leave a 5-star review on iTunes like Eliza K, who said, "This podcast is both warm and inviting, but real enough to push and motivate me." Thank you, Eliza. Or you can be like Dalton, who said, "Paul is an amazing host and his podcast is a must listen." Thank you, Dalton. And thank you to all of the over 100 people who have taken the time to rate and review this show 5 stars on iTunes, or the dozens who have left 5-star reviews on Spotify. It only takes a minute, and it helps me grow, it helps me reach a new audience, and it lets me know that this is helping someone, which just feels good. All you have to do is go to the show page of whatever app you're listening to and hit the little 5 stars. Or go to the comments section on YouTube and boom, that's it. And if you really want to show love, take a screenshot when you do it and tag me in your stories on social media at Change Made Easy, and I'll shout you out in an upcoming episode. All right, go leave that rating, and I'll see you back here every Tuesday and Thursday with new episodes of Change Made Easy.